Well, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. I think I now know what it feels like to be just in time. I arrived here about 30 seconds ago, for those of you who are astute enough to realise that it was me running through the foyer, grabbing a badge and grabbing a microphone as I walked through the back area there. So good to see everybody, and good to be back live again, as they say. I realise that a lot of people are listening in virtual, so I'm going to kick off. One of the things that I would like to say in terms of this particular sort of subject area is that what I've tried to do is to provide some context first, particularly from academic research, but then move into the practicalities of how we might then think about cognitive diversity in the workplace, and particularly for procurement and supply chain. Because for me, it's an incredibly important piece of what we need to think about and mobilize on as we go forward into the workplace. As you can see from my earlier slides, yes, there are copious, believe it or not, academic descriptions and definitions of what cognitive diversity actually is. The reality is that the short and simple is that it does actually represent lots of diverse skills, experiences, abilities, backgrounds, and that's really what we're looking for. So it's not really reaching in necessarily and directly into what I would refer to as the ethnicity or gender or anything like that at all, but it's actually looking at other attributes of diversity that are incredibly important when we're constructing teams to challenge complex issues and problems. One of the early points that I would probably leave you with is, in organizations where cognitive diversity is truly embraced, what they've witnessed is that, and we can actually measure this, is that 30% less risks occur as a consequence of having cognitive diverse teams, and there's 20% more innovation. So I'll just leave you with those two statistics to start the session. Sorry? Yes, 30% less risk and 20% more innovation. So, and I'll also then talk to you later on about some of the statistics that from some of the, I'll call it more global surveys that have been done on cognitive diversity. In fact, one report that I was reading recently showed that actually organizations that had 10% more cognitive diversity in FTSE companies actually delivered 3.5% more EBITDA. So there are some tangible results as a consequence of moving to something in this spectrum. So again, as I said before in the preface, there are lots and lots of academic work in this space, probably over a space of about 50 years, actually. So 50 years worth of research, and some of which, particularly from the likes of Curtin, who've talked about sort of opportunity, motive, cognitive level, cognitive style, but actually quite interestingly, didn't actually recognize or attribute culture and other things as being one of the additional layers to how we look at cognitive diversity. So in terms of some of the facts and myths, as I call it, in terms of cognitive diversity, Curtin developed a scoring mechanism that actually then created a way of looking at cognitive diversity in teams and organizations. And what you'll see is that there are some salient factors coming out of that in terms of research, in terms of women being how can I put it, about 1/3 of a standard deviation more adaptive than men. And in the modeling and research, it shows this sort of correlation of a 95% indice around the sort of the averages in most teams and organizations. So what does this really translate to in terms of attributes? And the way in which I probably see it as a direct result, and again, I scribbled, as you can see, some wonderful notes on these highly technical days, in terms of thinking about the ways in which cognitive teams work. And one of the things that you actually get to see is that some teams that are adaptive, so in other words, they think about the way in which they can utilize what pre-exists. In other words, what is already there, what doesn't need to be invented or created anew or afresh. The more adaptive types, in a sense, tend to be, the more sort of creative types, and more acceptable of sort of solutions, generally speaking. But when research has been done with teams to sort of run through exercises, one of the things that really intrigued me was that taking teams that are truly cognitive diverse, in other words, they come from different skill sets, different backgrounds, different, I'll call it, aspects and outlooks in terms of their experiences, generally perform a lot better in solutioneering and problem solving. In fact, I had to smile to myself because one of the studies actually showed that a team of PhD students and a team of medical doctors either failed to or ran out of time in completing some of the tasks. So what it said is it's nothing to do with intelligence, actually. It's about that diversity of experience that's really, really important. So you'd expect that a team of doctors or a team of PhD students would stand a pretty damn good chance of solving a challenge or a task over and above different people from different sectors, different walks of life, different socioeconomic backgrounds. Actually, interestingly, they were the ones that performed more highly. So again, there are lessons for us to learn in this particular space. So again, here again, this is where I then move into looking at the way in which culture does have a dynamic to play. And when this is mapped out across, Hofstede as a social sciences researcher, done huge amounts of work and unfortunately died recently, but a huge bank of work in terms of looking at the indices between how different cultures actually represent themselves in terms of being either collective or individualistic. So when we start to look at this, and one of the things I'm going to turn to my notes for, because I think it's quite important that we visualize this and we look at this and we understand what it means for us. But what you see is on the index that we've got in front of us, when you start to look, in fact, actually the top one should actually say indulgence versus restraint. So when we start to look at this on the where you have the camel, because that's the best way I can describe it, because otherwise I'm going mirror image. You've got restriction, and on the other end of the spectrum, you've got freedom. So you look at the different way in which different countries are represented, and then you look at sort of individualism versus collectivism. In the family context, on the far left-hand side of the diagram, you've got the me. It's all about me, self-centric, as opposed to, on the other side of the spectrum, about the we. And then masculinity, femininity, assertive on the left-hand side, or the camel side of the diagram. And then you've got the tolerance side on the right-hand side of the diagram. And then finally, when you look at uncertainty avoidance index, and this was quite interesting because it tells us a lot about how we operate. But you've got precision on the left-hand side of the argument. In other words, being really, really specific about something, as opposed to on the other side, a tolerance for ambiguity. So think about that in the context of how we then operate within multicultural, different sector, different background. It's not about the way in which we see it as individuals, it's about how others see it and interpret that information or the context of the situation. So hugely important that we understand that it's not simply the view that we look at something, it's the view that other people look at things. So I conceptualize this in terms of what does this really mean in terms of the different ways in which diversity presents itself. The automatic response, which is, I always have a cup of coffee in the morning. From the habitual bit, which is, it's just the subconscious. I always shut the bathroom door. It's that habitual thing. So starting to think about how do you move through the conceptual model of thinking, you think about the prescribed processes, which is, well, I know I have to press 3 different buttons on the microwave to get it to work. I have to go through that process, otherwise it's not going to work. But it's there. It's a prescribed process. There's nothing else I can do to change it. It's there. I have to follow that. You think about the personal preference. I get in the driving seat of the car after my wife's been in it, and the first thing I do is I change the air conditioning setting. I make it much cooler. Change the seating position, the steering wheel, etc., and off we go. This is my way. This is how I drive, as opposed to how somebody else might drive. Same mode of transport, but just a different way of using it, different way of getting from A to B. We then start to think about what I call the rational logical. How we apply formulas, how we utilize existing methods, the classic use of the spreadsheets. That's it, that's the way it is. We can't change it, but we know exactly how it works and we know how to use it. We then think about the idea transfer bit, which is somebody who's worked in one sector, construction, wherever it may be, and then goes into the pharmaceutical sector and says, hang on a minute, what I was doing over there, I can adapt that, and I can make that work over here. So this is starting to get into the more creative, adaptive side. And then you get the real innovators who basically tear up the rule book if you go to the far end of the spectrum. And the reality is what they say is, I don't care if it doesn't exist today, I'm going to create something that will solve that problem. So this is where the Dysons come in and start to say, right, there's a different way of doing this. We're not going to do it the same way as we did before. So when we start to think about then upskilling and maximizing our teams, this is where it gets really interesting for me, because the things that I often suggest to people is that we need to be thinking about value and not just cost or savings. Yes, we have to deliver those as part of I'll call it the overall package. We're not going to get away from that, guys. We all know that. However, let's think about value. And when I start to sort of think about these things, from my point of view, the make sense and translate. And you might think, well, what's he talking about there? Make sense and translate. What does that mean? The way in which I interpret some information may well need to be rephrased and repackaged so somebody else from a non-procurement background can understand what I'm talking about. I need to talk their language. They don't need to talk my language. So my job is to make sure I can take something complex, take something very commercial, and allow somebody else, through my translation, to make sense of what I'm talking about. So it's not just a linguistic thing. It's about restructuring or reordering or using different words or phrases or ways of communicating something. Really, really super important. Now, that's not about the logical rational. That's about recognizing that we have different people, almost effectively, in a sense, speaking different languages, like engineers or pharmacists or whatever it happens to be. They look at it in different ways. For me, then, thinking about our role as facilitators or enablers, this is not about me leading. This is about me then recognizing, how do I facilitate or enable something to happen that gets us to where we need to be? Thinking about the bridge builders, those people that just make the connections, those people that get other people talking to each other, exchanging ideas. Very, very important in cross-functional teams. Thinking about the critical thinking skills, and you go, what does that mean? It's about thinking about the process of thinking. It's about thinking and deconstructing things in a different way and reassembling them. Very, very important. It's not about simply utilizing the same ways of doing things. I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but it's there on the slides. So when I start to conceptualize this graphically, and I'm really, really looking at what I call the more complex types of arrangements, the outsourcing agreements, the multi-year contracts, things that are new or we've never done before, this is where, in a sense, we then start to have to think about that diversity and what we're doing and how we're doing it. So the key enablers for me for cognitive diversity, again, I'm not going to read the list out on the screen, it's there for all to see, but some of the things that I would pull out is that recognize it as a profession we have encouraged for many, many years people to come in from the STEM subjects. But just pause for a moment. Think about that as the entry ticket, and then think about the fact that a lot of things that we actually do are about persuading people to do something different, to change the order of things, to transform the way we do something, to move them to a new contract. Well, hang on a minute. That's about getting people to change. It's about interacting with people, about doing things differently. So the harsh reality is, when we think about the way and the route that people have come up through academic and professional qualifications. In fact, sadly for my PhD, I had to do a study of how much content was actually in the syllabus of academic qualifications and professional standards. It was less than 3% in the best of cases in terms of what I call the social skills and the people skills. So the harsh reality is that most organizations have to then work out and figure out, how am I going to upskill my teams and enable them to become more effective? Hugely important, hugely important. We can't rely simply on the processing or the rational skills or the logical skills. Because guess what? The chances are, if you do that and you rely upon it, you're going to be really disappointed or upset as a minimum. So the reality is, we have to compensate for these things and understand what that cognitive diversity does for us. So enabling sort of technologies and equipment to engage in a way that recognizes maybe disabilities, people with recognized disabilities that we've recognized in terms of, be it Asperger's, whatever it happens to be, but actually put those people in the right role. Boy, oh boy, they're like firing on all cylinders. They're amazing. So recognize that they may well have a place in your organization. And that is about embracing cognitive diversity. The one thing that I would say, though, is, and particularly for leaders, the reality is that when we start to think about assembling cognitively diverse teams, there are, how can I put it, challenges and watch-outs that we have to then consider, which is, if every person in this room thinks and sees things differently, what does that then mean for us as an enabler or a leader of a team that have got people looking at things in a different way? So take, for example, that tripod over there. If I was lying underneath it, I'd still be looking at the tripod, but my view would be very, very different to somebody who was sitting on that beam up there and looking down on the top of it, or from this view on the stage. We're still looking at exactly the same thing, but get somebody to describe it, you're going to have lots and lots of different descriptions. And that's the reality, and that's the reality that happens in the workplace. So the challenge is about getting people to see those other perspectives, not just simply the view or the perspective that you have. Super important that we get people to see that 360 view and recognize that they all exist and they're all legitimate and they're all appropriate. And there's a way of assembling those and bringing them together. So this is probably one of my favorite slides, whereby some studies that were done by some psychologists, which was, and we've probably all heard the tales about, this is how the managers see themselves, but this is how their team see them, or their organization sees them. And what you'll recognize in that diagram is that 5 of the squares on the top right-hand side, so 5 out of the 16 squares, they're not marked. But on the other side, they're all marked, because that's how they see themselves. You see the cluster in the center as opposed to the scatter diagram that you get. So there's very, very different views of how I see myself versus how somebody else sees me, hugely different. Your job as a leader or as a professional is to work out and to figure out what that means. and to understand those different dynamics. Because the perspective on a situation may well be very, very different and could be quite critical or crucial, even though I've seen situations in meeting rooms whereby I know, because I know the individual concerned has got a particular specialist expertise in some category that we're talking about, but they are the quiet voice that doesn't say anything, wants to go with the majority, doesn't want to upset things. The job of the leader is to make sure that they do have a voice and it is understood and it's not railroaded by I'll call it the louder brigade. That's probably me actually, but the louder ones in the room are not then left to rule the way in which the direction goes. It's enabling, if you like, everybody to have that unequivocal, unified voice across the piece. So one of the things I want you to think about, and I'll just let you dwell on it for a minute, which is think about the team or the teams that you work within, and think about then in terms of where your psychological safety and your cognitive diversity is in your teams. And which of those would you underline, mark off, correct, assign to your teams? Because depending on where you are, so I can say, right, okay, I've got a team at the moment, they're very appreciative, very considerate, but they're very controlling. Oh, they're very competitive in the team as well, not very flexible. Ooh, low psychological safety, not very cognitively diverse. They might think they are. The reality is they're not, because they think they've got some of the other attributes up here. So think about that as the way in which you then start to connect with and understand the team dynamics. So some considerations from my point of view, which would be, in summing up, think about the 4 attributes that I've listed there. Think about the fairness and respect. Think about the value and belonging piece. Is it safe and open environment? And are we empowering and growing our teams? Because the reality is, if you don't have those 4 ingredients, a bit like a cake, you don't have those 4 ingredients, chances are you don't have a cognitively diverse team. And you won't have a team that can then deliver innovation and drive out risk from what you're doing. That's it from me. Hopefully I've got somewhere near the time. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, David. Really great session again there, so thank you for persevering through the traffic, as we said, and coming along today. As I said earlier, if there's any questions from the floor, just throw your hand up and we'll come round to you. Okay, well, straight away, can we take one of those, please, Caitlin? If you can just state your name first, please.
Guy Strafford from Proxima. David, great session. The question I've got for you is, I read some research that argues that there is an optimum level of diversity. You can actually have teams that are too neurologically diverse.
Yep.
Is that something you can talk a little bit about? I mean, or dissent, if that's, I don't know, you may know more.
No, I think you're absolutely right, Guy. For me, and this is one of the things, hopefully, perhaps I didn't articulate it sufficiently in the time that I had allotted, but in constructing cognitively diverse teams, you've almost, in a sense, got to ensure then that you don't have, how can I put it, an extreme capitalist with some extreme environmentalist over here sort of thing, because you'll never ever manage that. You just won't manage it. It'll just be, clashes of the titans sort of thing. So we can't afford for that to happen. So I think that's where the skill and the care comes in. And that's why looking at the attributes and how you assemble teams is hugely important. It is important to get that cognitive diversity and accept that there will be some tension within those teams, and you won't always get absolute agreement. But the important thing maybe for me is, in setting out on a journey like that, is to help teams to say, it's okay to challenge in the right constructive way, and here's the rules type of thing. These are the rules for engagement. But I think at the same time then recognize that as a leader sometimes being explicit and saying, I will garner all of that information, and at some point, I will make a balanced view or decision as to the direction we're going to go in. Because if you don't, to your point, you either end up in complete stalemate and you go nowhere, or you just end up with a big fight, neither of which you actually need. So actually in constructing that, it is with some care, and I think that's where the skill and care of the leader in terms of understanding these issues is truly important. It's a bit like at times people have said to me, well, on occasions I've been invited by various people to say, we need a free radical in the team. Right, you're it then, because you can come in and make some sort of strange observations and challenges. But that is done in I'll call it, not in a controlled way, because that's probably the wrong word, but in a well orchestrated way that's intended to deliver a step change or an innovation. And so it is a part and parcel of that journey.
And there was another gentleman. It's quite a lot, actually, today.
Alex. Great talk on how recognising cognitive diversity could have real impact for your organisation. What are some of the trends do you think we could see in the next 5 to 10 years? Have large organisations recognise this, and what do you think we could see with them implementing changes?
I think what we'll see is I think you'll see a movement in terms of cognitive diversity at different rates of, I'll call it, acceleration over the next decade. The reason I say that is that the start point for some countries, and hence the reason why I think there is a cultural dynamic to this. So I have to smile because I actually lived in Brazil for about 4 years. But Brazil, in terms of people on the board and in senior positions, they represent, I think, something like 3%. Currently in the UK, it's about 22%. So as you can see, the start points are very, very different. So what you'll see is I think, a continued progression. I hope we never get to the position whereby it's legislated that we have specific, if you like, types, I'll call it, by socially constructed, if you like, requirements to represent senior leadership, because it should be on the basis of capability, and hence the reason why cognitive diversity is so important, I think, rather than just talking about gender or ethnic diversity. So I think for me, we will see that. I think it's almost back to then the lowest common denominator in some ways in a global economy will actually in some ways be the controlling point. So it's actually super important that we help others to see the potential and the possibilities to be more cognitively diverse in their teams and to hire people from different backgrounds, from different socioeconomic situations, etc., so that we can encourage that and bring that through. But I don't see any sort of, I may be proven wrong, but I don't see any massive step change in the journey that we've been on so far. I don't see any radical sort of, that will change the paradigm. I don't see that. I think it's going to continue to be incremental.
Any more questions?
Hi there, Will Ross from Tendo. I really find that interesting point about opportunity, and when it comes to assembling teams, how do you factor in different individuals who have different time frames in mind in terms of, say, you're assembling a team with frontline workers as well as VPs. Some are going to be around for less time. They may even not see out the project. How do you think about diversity when it plays out across time?
I think you've got some people who probably, how can I put it, maybe have the opportunity to push the boundaries more than others, and therefore will create, I'll call it, the examples and the, dare I call it, the case studies for saying, look, this is what we can do. I mean, I've seen situations where people with, extreme autism or Asperger's, and don't really welcome, social contact, absolutely must have things set out exactly precisely in exactly the same way every day, every hour of the day, being, how can I put it, given environments in which they can actually flourish and be really contributory towards creating value within organizations. And so therefore I think, we're going to have to think about that more. And maybe there's an opportunity with this sort of whole gear shift that we've had with the pandemic and getting people to work from home and recognizing that there is a way in which maybe that could actually be a catalyst for helping some of these things. And we shouldn't sort of just simply go, oh, right, let's revert back to where we were, 2019, because that maybe is going to be detrimental to actually allowing some things to progress. On the flip side of that, there are other things that we recognize because of innovation, the way in which we innovate as I call it as a social society. We do rely on that interaction with others and that spark and that ability to be able to create things. So I do think that we've maybe got some of a catalyst here, and the way in which leaders embrace the utilization of some of those things, I think again will pick up, but unfortunately I don't think at the pace that hopefully will be commensurate, if you like, with the contribution that they can make to society and the economy.
Okay, one more from the gentleman at the back, please.
Excuse me, my name's Joe and I work for BMG. I was fascinated by what you said about Asperger's and autism and sort of neurological conditions of that type. You referenced businesses that had identified real potential in people and had created structures and frameworks that allowed them to achieve that potential.
Yeah.
Was there a commonality amongst those businesses that enabled them to be far-sighted enough to see that potential and to go down that path? And is that something that the rest of us can learn from and apply to our own businesses?
I think it is in a microcosm way. The way in which, some of the examples that I've seen and read about are, I guess, those companies, those organizations that contribute heavily to the digital economy. So the likes of Amazon, Google, etc. Yeah. However, when you look at the advent of BIM, building information management sort of technology and systems being deployed in the construction and property industries, you can start to see that a microcosm of that actually wouldn't be a bad thing to utilize in those instances, particularly where I've seen trials of BIM modeling utilized to simulate safety in construction, as an example. So it's modeling, if you like, how particularly a built environment type asset gets constructed and all the different phases it goes through, actually getting some of that thinking and some of that application through people that, how can I put it, are more adept at being able to work with technology and work as a self-directed individual as opposed to part of a team, then I think there are huge possibilities. And I think that's about then allowing us as a society and an economic force to actually embrace all of that and get more horsepower basically behind what we're doing. So yes, in short.
Okay, that's all we've got time.
Thank you.
Please show your appreciation to David. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just take that clicker.